Welcome. My name is Pete Milner. I'm a teaching pastor at the Prayer House, and I'm here to talk to you about Revelation, specifically the book Revelation, the book of the Apocalypse of John. This is what we're talking about today, and I'm doing it because some people ask me, is this the end of the world? Are COVID-19 and the global shutdown and the different forces that are at work in the world today, are they the sign of the imminent end of the earth? Now, I'm not going to answer that question right now. I think my thoughts will become clear as we go. But what I want to do is understand the text of the book of Revelation in this video. That's what I want to do the most. And to do that, I'm going to be recruiting three substantial bodies of opinion within the church now and throughout Christian history. And these three approaches are going to teach us what the text of Revelation says from three different perspectives. Now, the reason I'm going to do it this way is because I don't think that trusting one person to explain everything to you is that good of a way to go about things. You might have discovered somebody who teaches in a way that makes you think everything they say is correct. But what happens often in the church is we close the loop. We close the sort of circle of people that we listen to, and we reduce it down to a quite small pile of the church. And that makes us either become extremely hostile towards the other kind of groups within the Church of Jesus Christ, or it can make us just ignorant of what other approaches there are. It often controls us with a sort of powerful sense that whatever this person says is true, and anyone who doubts it is not trustworthy. And I don't think that's safe for the church. I think that we have to see what the fruit is of each perspective in order to understand whether or not we should believe it. So I'm going to start by introducing 9 contentious things that happen in Revelation, the text, and I'm going to be explaining what you could do with those texts from 3 separate interpretational perspectives. Okay, so the first one, we're going to ask the purpose of the book, and we're looking at the main intention of the author. And I've got the 3 groups there, and you may have angry thoughts already about which words I've used to categorize each one. But we're going to introduce you to the preterist interpretation first. So preterist and amillennial approach suggests that the main intention of the author is a message of hope and exhortation to people in confusion about persecution in the first century. So what preterism means is past, and it suggests that the purpose of the book, the reason it was written, was to address things that were at work in the first century AD. So the end of the Second Temple period, the persecution of the Christian church by the Roman Empire, the destruction of Judea as a state, the beginnings of the early church, the difficulty with evangelizing the Jewish people, all of those things the preterist would say were the main driving forces behind the book of Revelation, and that its principal reason for being created was to speak to those things in much the same way that we would understand to be true of the epistles, for instance. You know, we read Apostle Paul's letter to the Galatians, and we assume that this is a kind of contextual based approach of saying, here's what's going on now, here's what I want you to do about it. But it's easier with an epistle, isn't it? It's easy to look at the letter to the Galatians and think, well, this is an answer to some questions from the time. It's harder with Revelation because Revelation is so much more abstract. But the preterist approach is exactly that, to say that Revelation is an abstract approach to the contextual problems of the first century. So, the historicist approach, that second column there. The historicists are the ones who say this is an explanation of why the second coming has taken so long to happen. So many people believe that the early church, the very first sort of era of the church, had people who believed in the main that the end of things was nigh. And so in the first century, if you've got people saying Jesus is coming back, he's left, and he'll be coming back within the lifetime of people who saw him when he was alive, popular belief, then it must be coming soon, it must be coming soon, it must be coming soon. And so these people will believe that, the historicists will believe that the whole of history from that point until this point, and even beyond and into the future, is really, it was called in advance. So the text of Revelation, they'll say, is embedded within it is the secrets of all the most important things that have happened to humans in the time since the first century. So if it's important, the Bible must have something to say about it, right? That's the perspective. And so the conquest of Asia, the rise of Islam, the Second World War, Adolf Hitler, many people believe in the historicist perspective that those things are kind of hidden prophetically in the text of Revelation, and that we should be able to look at Revelation and understand our context today. So many people are kind of bringing out those things about global plagues that they find in Revelation and thinking, well, we're in the middle of a global plague right now. That must mean we're kind of at this point in the book, because it's a sort of linear tale of how history went after Jesus. That's a historicist perspective. The third one I've called the dispensational or premillennial approach, and in some ways you might disagree with whether or not that's fair, but what we're talking about when we talk about this third column is these are people who believe that this is a play-by-play for the end of the world, a playbook for the end of days, which will help the remnant of the church survive and endure the catastrophic time of the end. So when we're talking about the dispensational premillennial approach, we're talking about people who believe that this book, the primary purpose of it is to help the people who are in the time of the end to navigate their difficult situation, which will be, absolutely insane. It will be asteroids and plagues, wars and meteorites and all sorts of things like that. So that's the third perspective. And what I'm going to do now is have a look at what these three perspectives think is the best use of Revelation by the church today. Okay, so all three forces are alive and well in the Church of Jesus Christ today: the preterist, the historicist, and the dispensational. And I want to show you what they think we should be doing with it. So the preterist and amillennial will be saying that the best use of Revelation is kind of abstract, it's idealistic, and what we've got to do is place ourselves in the circumstance of suffering so that we can more clearly portray Christ to our community. And the idea is that there's a big kind of war happening in heaven right now, which we have to be able to identify with and understand so that we can communicate from the place of suffering and opposition and difficulty to the world. It helps us evangelize, basically. The historicist group will be saying the job is to educate ourselves on what God sees as the most important moments from what would become history and become aware of the imminent end. Now, there is a slight kind of tendency within historicism to always place yourself at the end. Now, as a kind of overall approach, it's about 200 years old. Okay, so the first people who sort of lined up the text of Revelation with the progression of human history, normally particularly Western history, have said that for kind of 200 years people have been putting this opinion about, and almost always they put themselves at the end. So 200 years ago, and the kind of Victorian period in England and the kind of pre-Civil War period in the United States was an absolute hotbed for this approach, and people were trying to look at the symbols in Revelation and understand them as things that were represented in the kind of passage of real history through the Middle Ages and the early modern period, for instance, and they'd always put themselves at the end. Now we're kind of 200 years after that, and people still see it the same way. They interpret the symbols slightly differently, but always put themselves at the end. No historicist ever seems to put themselves in the middle. Third, dispensational premillennial approach. What's the best use of the document by the 21st century? Is to warn the world and the church of the approaching end time, to give the remnant community its best chance of holding on till the end. So if you're a dispensationalist and or a premillennial, you will be thinking that right before the end, something big is going to happen and it's going to change the game for everybody. And when that happens, and we realise we are in the end times, we're going to need a playbook to understand what the enemy's going to do. We have to understand what God is going to do. We have to understand what the church should be doing. And that's the third approach, really, to say the best thing we can do for it is keep it safe as like a playbook to help us understand the context of the end. Now, most of the people who ask me, is this the end of days, are in that third group. And it's an enormously large and powerful force, particularly within Protestant Christianity, and particularly amongst evangelicals and people who don't identify with what we call magisterial denominations. Okay, so what I mean is the Reformed Church are not so into this. The standard approach of Anglicanism, for instance, not really into this. But many people within the evangelical movement today are very much into this. And so seeing it in its context might help you understand who else might be on the same page as you in terms of your approach. Now let's go to the third contentious point, and we'll look at the beginning of the book after its introduction, and John sort of saying, I'm John and I was your brother and I saw this revelation. There's 7 letters which are written to 7 churches, which are all in what we would now call Western Turkey, but of course had no Turkish people in it in those days. They were Greek people speaking Greek, and they were part of the Roman Empire. So the preterist would say that these 7 letters are not just educative points on the situation of the first century church history, but they're also enlightening examples of what can happen to churches at any time. So Jesus writes the letters through John and says, pass these to the 7 churches which are in the province of Asia. And they have lots of information about, I like this thing that you're doing, or you've got this problem and I want it solved. And, you know, if you stand steadfast to the end, I'll give you a crown of life or a white robe or a stone with a name on it that nobody else will know except me. And these things are promises to people that were really alive when John wrote this book. But yet, idealistically, abstractly, in the sense of a removed kind of general interpretational sense, the preterists would say they're also kind of guides to how churches can go wrong today, and always, you know, Christian history should always be full of the attempt to read these letters, understand that they contain certain guides and warnings to the situations we find ourselves in. The historicists will say they're not only educative points on first century church history, but they also mark distinct historical areas of the church's history. So the 7 in the sequence, they kind of show you a linear progression of the church in history. And so you start with, you know, letter 1 for the apostolic age when the apostles are still alive. Then letter 2 kind of shows you what God thinks of the patristic age, or the age of the sort of church fathers, as we say, kind of up until the early Middle Ages. And then you've got a 3rd letter which takes you through the Middle Ages, and a 4th letter which takes you through to the Reformation, and the 5th letter takes you to the early modern period. And by the time you get to the 7th, you always end up with today. So that was true 200 years ago, it's true today. People see the church age, they say, we are in the Laodicean age, the age where people go lukewarm, and the age where God wants us to wake up and get back on board. And the historicist approach is part of what popularized the way that Christians see that letter in the 7th of the sequence as being about themselves. So that's the historicist perspective. Now, the dispensational and premillennial approach very much agrees with that. I mean, I can't tell for sure which one happened first, dispensational premillennialism or historicism, on this one. I haven't done enough research to be able to say for sure, but they very much take the same approach. So they follow the historicist position, also identifying ourselves as the Laodiceans, and therefore as those who will experience the last things, the end of time, the imminent global catastrophes of the rest of Revelation. So if you're a dispensational premillennialist, if you're a person who sort of understands things to have played out that way, both the historicist and the dispensationalist will see ourselves as being in the time of the end, and all the rest of the text of Revelation, which sort of follows on from those 7 letters, are going to be what next. And what you're really looking for, if you belong to any of these interpretational groups, is you're saying, I think what's going to happen next is one of these great big plagues that start to happen. So let's just have a look at the plagues for a second. The 4th contentious point is the catastrophes. The seals, the bowls, the judgment in heaven. John sees people blowing a trumpet or pouring out a bowl on the earth or breaking a seal. And each one of these comes with a description of a horrendously destructive event. Now, the preterist and the amillennial says that these are parables. They're poetic kind of symbolizations, conceptualizations of the catastrophe of 70 AD, destruction of Jerusalem, and the Roman persecutions for the first century church. So the preterist says that the big destructive event, the sort of awful thing where there's an abomination in the temple and the destruction of everything that is good in the world, that is manifested for the preterist as the event of Titus, the Roman general's destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, where they performed kind of horrible blasphemies in the temple, and they destroyed the temple and the Temple Mount itself, and basically ended the Second Temple period of Judaism. And the preterist says that's the catastrophe. That's what these judgments kind of symbolize. It's that God kind of looked towards Jerusalem and destroyed it and allowed that kind of passage of such grievous evil to make an end of the old way and make a new beginning where his church would have no temple, and they would be scattered throughout the world, and they'd be sort of subject to all kinds of other forces, but they would be sort of signed and sealed by him himself and have no need of a geopolitical reality of a nation of Israel. That's the preterist approach. If you are in the historicist approach, again, what I said before, descriptive anticipations of the most significant events of global history from the first century into the near future. So the historicist says that these seals and bowls and trumpet judgments are things that have mostly already happened to the world. And you can read historicist perspectives on Revelation all over the place, but what they'll often see is the sort of army of locusts, for instance, that sort of unveiled from the pit of the abyss onto the earth, these sort of horse rider, locust, ravenous, poisonous beast things with a smoky cloud everywhere. They'll see those things as being perhaps the Asiatic invasions of the Mongols and Huns in the medieval period. And they'll say that's what this is. The text holds a sort of secret key to unlock the meaning of the massive global forces that are unworked in global conflict and volcanic and earthquake disruptions and things like that. Whereas the dispensational premillennial approach would put all those judgments, or pretty well all of them, into the future. And they would say this is a playbook of how the God will destroy the earth and give unraptured humanity its last chance to turn to him before the end of time as we know it. Now, that word rapture probably needs a bit of explanation. What I mean by rapture is the taking up of the church into heaven. So this group generally believe that the church itself, like Noah's Ark, will be kept safe in heaven while God destroys the earth. So if you believe in Jesus, the theory goes of the rapture, if you believe in Jesus and you're part of the true church and you hold fast to all the promises, then before Jesus kind of nukes the earth, for want of a better word, the church will sort of disappear all of a sudden in a blinking of an eye, in an instant. One will be taken, the other left, and they use the sort of language of several parts of the New Testament to back up that idea. And they'll say it would be like Elijah, but for everybody. We'll all be whisked up into the clouds and then we'll be in heaven. And those left behind, those sort of on earth, are going to have to deal with the destruction of the earth, the reign of the Antichrist, the sort of horrendous end that is portrayed in Revelation. And that's what the meaning of it is. That's what these catastrophes describe for the dispensational premillennialists. Now, the question then becomes, well, if that happens, then how come there are people who still believe on earth during that time? And you say, well, let me tell you. The sealing of the 144,000 is a peculiar passage. It appears a couple of times, this number in Revelation, and it always refers to a group which are listed in Revelation as belonging to the 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each tribe. There's lots to say about which tribes are in that list and why that's interesting, but I'm not going to go into that now. But from the preterist perspective, what this is a poetic and stylized visualization of Jewish believers in Jesus in the first century, the remnant of Judaism. So God basically signs and seals 144,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel and sends them out to be his ambassadors in the world. Now, a preterist says what that means is it's the group of Jewish people who believed in Jesus, followed the teachings of Christ, and wrote the New Testament. People like Peter, Paul, John, for instance, but working out into all the kind of Jewish believers in the early church. Those are the 144,000. What they did then was spread out across the known world and tell everybody about it. That's the preterist perspective. If you are a historicist, you'll say that what this is a symbol of the great evangelists, the global evangelists who traveled the world to win disciples in every country. And many of them would say that what happened from the sort of age of exploration onwards, the sort of early modern period where Europeans started to travel the world, and you'd have Jesuit missionaries and Protestant missionaries traveling to the Americas, to Africa, to Asia, to the South Pacific. What they did and what they were doing was performing the work of this symbol. That's what a historicist might say, that it means global evangelism. Now, if you are a dispensational premillennialist or any other such thing, you will say that what happens is the rapture happens and the whole church disappears all of a sudden. And out of those left behind, there'll be a group of Jewish people who aren't raptured because they don't believe in Jesus and they don't believe in the new covenant. They don't believe in the cross of Christ and his resurrection and all the rest of it. They'll be left behind, but from the basis of the strength of their belief in the Old Testament, for instance, the scriptures of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, they will realize their error and disciple a remnant community which becomes a sort of last church during the very last days. So imagine all the church suddenly disappeared. Who would there be to explain who Jesus is, what the deal is with the Messiah, with Old Testament prophecy coming true, and all this stuff about the end times? Well, apparently it will be Jewish people who do not believe in the Messiah at all at the moment, but when he raptures the church, they suddenly will. And this has another sort of textual parallel in Romans 9, 10, and 11, where the Apostle Paul promises that what will happen is there'll be a great turning as Israel sort of suddenly becomes, Jewish people become, they sort of realize they've missed it. And that's what that multitude is. The 144,000 will be Jewish people who realize that they should have believed in the Messiah, and they'll be the new evangelists in the world after the rapture. That's the dispensational premillennialist approach. So that's an extremely popular one within Protestant evangelicalism, and the Zionism and the kind of Israeli exceptionalism that's in the church today is mostly due to people who believe these perspectives. Now again, this kind of way of looking at things appeared around about 200 years ago, maybe 300, depending on who you listen to and what you're prepared to accept is a genuine expression of this belief. But these people from kind of John Nelson Darby and Cyrus Schofield, they produced this body of belief that said, really, there has to be a state, a geopolitical Jewish state with a temple on the Temple Mount before the end can come. Otherwise, we can't make sense of Jesus' Olivet discourse in Matthew 23-24. So if that's you, then that will very strongly resonate with you and say, well, that sounds like total sense. But I can see it in historical perspective, and I hope you're beginning to as well, that it's not the only approach. So let's have a look at the next contentious point. After the 144,000, there is a great multitude that suddenly appears in heaven. Now, the preterists will say this is the promise of heaven for all who suffer death through persecution or otherwise as part of the church. Now, the people that appear in heaven and have white robes, John says, who are these that are here? Well, the angel says to John, who are these that are here? And John says, well, I bet you know. And the angel says, these are those who are taken out of the great tribulation. Now, if you're a preterist and an amillennial, you will say that those people are they're the martyrs. They're people who are killed in the time of persecution. They're sort of taken to heaven to be with God and to see Christ face to face, before the end. But if you are a historicist, then what you'll say about the great multitude is that they are all Christians who have died since Jesus, who now await us in heaven, and their number is sort of gradually increasing as people die and are taken to heaven after they die. And finally, the dispensational or premillennial approach is to say that these are the raptured church. And when it says they were taken out of the great persecution, it means they were raptured. That's what they would say. And so taken all of a sudden disappearance of all the faithful believers at some point in the near future. Remember, the dispensational approach often puts themselves and ourselves and the current place right before the end. So that's part of what the belief does. It often thinks that we're the generation that will have to see the end. And there's lots of reasons why, but it often works out that way. That's all. Now then, the next historical point, the seventh contentious point, is a very surprising and arresting kind of picture. It says a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman who was with child, was about to give birth, a great dragon, and is a really bizarre picture. And to the reader, it often seems straightforward that this is somehow a kind of summary retelling of the events of the Nativity and the birth of Christ and the sort of establishment of the church. So what I've done here is I've said the preterist approach is to say it's a retelling of the events of the establishment of the church from a heavenly perspective rather than a historical perspective given to us by the gospel writers. And what I mean is that the Nativity and the Gospels record Jesus coming to earth, being born of a virgin, raising Nazareth, and sort of beginning his ministry. And nobody saw dragons and the war in heaven or the archangels fighting against the devil and his angels. People didn't see that when they were walking around in the first century. But this is like a retelling of it from the perspective of what was happening in heaven. And as you'll see, I've said that the historicists and the dispensational premillennialists will agree with this. And they'll say, yeah, that's what it means. That's the symbol. Now, it does raise an interesting question, which is, if this piece, which happens right in the middle, is a symbolic retelling of what happened in the first century, i.e. the birth and coming of Christ, then why is it in the middle of the book? Because if it is a play-by-play, either for church history over the last 20 centuries or the end of days, then why is there suddenly this thing which is so clearly a parable or a sort of retelling from a heavenly perspective of the events of the first century? The preterist says, you see, that proves that the whole book is exactly what that is. And the historicist or the premillennialist might say, no, it's just sort of a kind of interim. It's a halfway point. It's a halfway show, halftime show. It's a thing which helps us remember and understand what the whole point of everything is before we get into the most difficult phase, which is the last phase. It's a difficult one. It is a difficult one, but one thing is that this contentious point is agreed upon by basically all Revelation interpreters within the Christian church, and I think that's worth noticing. Next, there are some characters which appear: a beast, a false prophet, and an adulteress, the whore of Babylon, and there is a mark of the beast and an image of the beast, and everybody has to sort of worship the beast and accept his mark, and if they do, that basically gets them out of contention for going to heaven at the end of days. Now, the preterist says this is mainly two things. A, it is the main characters of the first century tyrants, Nero, Domitian, Titus, Vespasian, the Roman emperors and generals who perpetrated the grievous evils against the Jewish nation and the church. So those persecutors and those invaders who destroyed the temple and Jerusalem and created the Jewish war, and the first century's main baddies. That's what they are. B, it is also a warning which transcends any historical circumstance, not to go the way of the world, but instead to stay faithful to Jesus. So the preterist perspective is to say that the thing it is in the first instance is a description in a way of the primary baddies of the first century. This is a sort of stylized telling of what they were like from a heavenly perspective. And secondly, it's a warning that this can happen to any time, any place, any people, anywhere. And the suffering church that had to deal with the persecutions of the Inquisition or the later Roman emperors or the sort of rulers of countries far away in different phases through history have all sort of understood that that's the case, that there's always an antichrist. You know, as John says in one of his letters, he says, you know, even now many antichrists have come. And the whole reason why we see these in preterism as being a kind of constantly available sort of resource for understanding what a persecutor is this same ideal and abstract way of interpreting the whole book of Revelation. And so when the preterist sees a persecuted church in a country in the world, like maybe Iran or North Korea, for instance, they're not surprised, because they think, well, the church is always persecuted, and it's usually persecuted somewhere. And if we're not being persecuted, then that might be a good reason to suggest that we're actually not being authentic. The world can never accept the gospel and never accept the church, and if we are at peace with the world and at peace with the prime movers and forces that it's sort of represented by, then that's probably a bad thing, because there's always a beast. You know, there's always a false prophet. There's always an adulteress. There's always Babylon, always available. And these things are symbols of something which always happens, not necessarily signs of the imminent end. But if you are a historicist, then when you look at those characters, what you see is two main things as well. The first thing is a series of descriptions of later historical events such as the French Revolution, Second World War, establishment of global capitalism, and the sort of description of Babylon, which is sort of set up to govern the world through commodities and tradable goods, is, for the historicist, a sort of summary of the European Age of Discovery culminating in the global financial capitalist system, which basically extends to all countries and all places in the world. But secondly, finally, an explicit prediction of an eschatological person and group of people who are going to come and rule the earth for a few years before the end of the world. So again, the historicist always sees themselves right before the end, and the belief is that these characters will appear in a big new way to set up a literal global government that kind of rules the earth and oppresses the church in a global united way. And the historicist looks at that and says, they are going to be like that. The dispensational premillennialist, as we saw, also sees it that way, that they're end times figures who will appear. There'll be literal people, you know, possibly men and women, who appear to symbolize and embody the global government of the world under one antichrist. You know, that there'll be a Christ who rules the church and an antichrist who rules the godless world of the time, and they'll have absolute power to kill and maim and destroy and control, and that's what the church has to watch out for. Finally, our last point of the 9 is the 1,000 years, the millennium. And the Revelation text includes this reference to, then there will be 1,000 years where Christ reigns on the earth. Now, if you're an amillennial, that means a non-millennialist. What you believe is that it is a non-literal time period. So it could be 1,000 years, it could be however long, it doesn't really matter. But it is a time period in which we now currently live. So for the amillennialist, the belief is that it is where Jesus' kingdom is established in the earth through the church, bringing peace, freedom, and salvation to the material universe under his lordship. So the preterist says that what happened with the destruction of the Second Temple and the great evil that befell the Judea of the first century in 70 AD, what it was a sign that the old order of things has passed away, the new thing has come, and Jesus Christ is enthroned on the earth through the church, and that he rules and has dominion through the church. And that is the explanation of what the millennium is. The 1,000 years where Christ reigns on earth through Jerusalem in the text is what we have now. So we are now living, according to the amillennialists, in the age where Satan has had his powers sort of bound. He's locked away. He's sort of shut out. And dominion of the earth no longer belongs to him alone. You know, it's Christ's kingdom is here, and it's established, and it's expanding, and eventually it's going to fill the whole earth. And after that, you know, any end that will come then. So you can see that embedded within amillennialism is a belief that the gospel and the church will sort of keep going, and that rather than seeing the church in retreat and sort of an ever shrinking pile of increasingly oppressed people, it sees that the end of the church, the goal of the church, is to expand and have dominion over all nations and all people and all tongues, and for Jesus Christ to be the supreme ruler of all people, all nations, all languages, people and tongues, etc. That's the goal. And so the 1,000 years for the amillennialist is to say that this is the age of the church. If you're a historicist, you say this is a probably literal time period in the future, which will be a great resting time for the church after the destruction of the unbelieving world and unbelieving nations, and after that will come the actual end. So if you're a historicist, what you believe is that Jesus will come back and reign on the earth for a 1,000-year long marriage feast where the church and him will just be on the earth, and the earth will find its peace and finally have rest from war, and people will just live a really long time and enjoy this great time of where the church becomes all it could be, with Jesus being available, being here, present on the earth for 1,000 years, at which point he's going to sort of stand up and say, right, now we're having the end. Got it? Okay. So last thing is the dispensational premillennialist picture of the 1,000 years, the millennium, and it believes that it is a literal time period between Jesus' defeat of the unbelieving world and then Jesus' final defeat of Satan and the actual end. So in the text of Revelation, there's this really interesting part where Satan is bound for the time of the millennium where Jesus reigns on the earth. And after that, he's set free for a short time, and he goes off and he deceives the nations again, and he raises them all for an army attack against Jesus and the church. But finally, he is judged and thrown hand and foot and tail into the lake of fire, which was prepared for him and his angels since the beginning of time, apparently. So if you're a premillennialist, what you believe is that the millennium is going to come, and after that will be the final judgment. You can see again the historicist and the dispensationalist, sort of, they very much overlap. The approach is very similar. And so the question is, now that we've looked at all that, the question is, what's happening now? Where are we? What are we doing here? What is the church? What is our mission? Let me tell you what it's not. The mission of the church is not to run and hide. It is not to cower and fear and give in to rampant speculation and disinformation. It's not to wield conspiracy theories as if they were spiritual tools. It is to be the church on earth, the symbol and sign of the hope and promise and fulfillment of Jesus Christ and his gospel, now, tomorrow, every day, until he decides to end the earth. Now, many people, if you went back in time and you told them in the 1800s that we were still all going to be here in the 21st century, they would never have believed you. The Millerites and the people, the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses that sort of kind of all participated in that sort of broiling, frothing idea that the world was about to end, those people would never believe that 200 years later we'd still have a church and a world and a global system that still looked actually very distinctively the same. They would never believe you. And the reason why is because they all believed that it would happen in their day, that they would live to see it, or at least their children would live to see it, and all of them were wrong. Those people gave into a paranoia and a fear that absolutely paralyzed them. The reason they kind of shrank down and became like cults was because they could not accept the wisdom and breadth of the church as expressed through the whole gospel being preached. They thought, only we have the true interpretation. Only we are holding the torch. Only we have the secret key to unlocking the Bible in terms of being a sort of right and true prophecy. And the kind of Brethren Church and the Protestants, Baptists, lots and lots of groups have given into this over time and believed that the only people who really believe are the people who are living in a near constant state of expectation of the end. Now, is it wrong to have a near constant expectation of the end? Not really. But what is the gospel? Is it to run and hide? Stash yourself away underneath a rock somewhere with a bunch of weapons, getting ready to fight the one world government? It's not the gospel. The gospel is the salt and light of the world. It is the light of men, embodied in the person and work of Jesus Christ, who came to this earth not just to destroy it, but to save it, to seek and to save what was lost, to reach out and touch the hurting and the broken and the dying and the ostracized and the disenfranchised and the smelly, to be a symbol of God expressing himself in humanity. Let's do that, shall we?